My name is David. I'm 52 years old, and I haven't worked in healthcare for 3 years now. I was a psychiatric orderly at Riverside State Hospital in upstate New York from 2001 to 2004, and what happened during my last month there is something I've never fully talked about until now. I need to give you some context first. Riverside was built in the 1960s as a state psychiatric facility. By the time I worked there, it was one of those old institutions that was slowly being phased out. The buildings were outdated, the funding was terrible, and they were always understaffed. I started working there right out of college. I got my degree in psychology and thought I wanted to go into clinical work eventually, so being an orderly seemed like good experience. The pay was okay, and honestly, I needed the job. The hospital had 3 main units. Unit A was for patients who were relatively stable, mostly people with depression or anxiety who needed short-term care. Unit B was the long-term care unit for patients with chronic conditions like schizophrenia or bipolar disorder. Unit C was the secure unit. That's where they kept the patients who were considered dangerous, either to themselves or others. Most of them were court-ordered to be there. I worked rotating shifts, but most of the time I was on the night shift for Unit C, 11 p.m. to 7 a.m., Wednesday through Sunday. There were usually 3 orderlies on duty per shift, 2 nurses, and a supervising doctor who was on call but rarely came in unless there was an emergency. Unit C had 32 beds spread across 2 hallways. The patients had individual rooms with heavy doors that locked from the outside. There was a common area with some tables and chairs, a TV that barely worked, and a medication dispensary station where we distribute meds. The work itself wasn't complicated. We do bed checks every hour, make sure patients took their medications, break up fights when they happened, and basically keep everyone safe until the day shift arrived. Some nights were quiet. Other nights were chaos. You never really knew what you were going to get. I'm going to tell you about a patient named Christopher Hale. He was admitted to Unit C in late January of 2003. I remember the date because it was the week of a big ice storm that knocked out power across half the county. The hospital had backup generators, but we were running on limited electricity for about 3 days. Christopher was 46 years old. He'd been found by police wandering along a highway at 3 in the morning, barefoot in the snow, rambling about angels and demons. He was severely dehydrated and malnourished. They brought him to the ER first, then transferred him to us once he was medically stable. His admission papers said he had a history of schizophrenia and that he'd been off his medications for at least 6 months. No fixed address. No family that could be contacted. He'd basically been living on the streets. I was on duty the night they brought him in. 2 police officers escorted him onto the unit around 1 a.m. Christopher was thin, probably only weighed about 140 pounds. He had long gray hair and a beard. He was calm when they walked him in, didn't resist or anything. Dr. Brennan, the psychiatrist on call, did the intake evaluation while I stood by in case there were any issues. Christopher answered all the questions in this very flat, emotionless voice. When Dr. Brennan asked him why he'd been walking along the highway, Christopher said he was looking for the threshold. Dr. Brennan asked what that meant, and Christopher said the threshold between here and there, between the living and the dead. Dr. Brennan prescribed him antipsychotics and assigned him to room 14, which was at the end of the east hallway. We got him settled in, gave him some hospital clothes, and I showed him where everything was. He didn't say much to me, just nodded and went into his room. I locked the door from the outside like protocol required for new admissions and went back to the nurse's station. The first week Christopher was there, he was quiet. He'd come out for meals, take his medication without any fuss, and spend most of his time sitting in his room staring at the wall. Some of the other orderlies commented that he was one of the easier patients we'd had in a while. But something about him bothered me. It wasn't anything specific. Just this feeling I got when I was around him. Like he was watching me even when he wasn't looking at me. About 10 days after his admission, things started getting strange. I was doing my hourly bed check around 2 a.m., and when I looked through the observation window in Christopher's door, he was standing in the middle of his room, facing the corner. Not moving. Just standing there. I watched him for a few minutes, and he didn't move at all. I made a note in the log and continued my rounds. The next night, same thing. 2 a.m., Christopher was standing in the corner. This time I opened the door and asked if he was okay. He didn't turn around. He just said in that flat voice, "They're calling me." Asked who was calling him. He said, "The ones on the other side of the threshold." I reported this to the nurse, a woman named Janet, who'd worked at Riverside for about 15 years. She said it was probably just his schizophrenia manifesting. The medications took time to work. She'd make a note for Dr. Brennan to review in the morning. I went back to my rounds, but I kept checking on Christopher every time I passed his room. Each time, he was still standing in that corner. Around 4 a.m., I was in the common area helping another patient who'd had a nightmare and couldn't get back to sleep. I heard a loud bang come from the east hallway. I ran down there and found Christopher's door wide open. This shouldn't have been possible. The doors lock from the outside with a key, and I had the only set of keys for that hallway on my belt. I checked my belt. The keys were still there. I looked into Christopher's room. He was sitting on his bed now, completely calm. I asked him how his door opened, and he said, "They opened it for me." I asked who. He said, "The others. They're here now. They've been waiting." My heart was racing, but I tried to stay calm. I checked the lock mechanism on the door. It wasn't broken. It had just somehow unlocked. I closed the door and locked it again, then went to find Janet. I told her what happened, and she came down to look at the door herself. She tested it a few times. It seemed to be working fine. She said maybe I hadn't locked it properly the last time I checked on him. I knew that wasn't true, but I didn't argue. She made another note for maintenance to check the lock, and we moved on. The following night, Christopher's door was found open again. This time it happened around midnight. I know for a fact I'd locked it because I'd checked it twice after the previous incident. When I found it open, Christopher was standing in the hallway outside his room. He looked at me and said, "They want to show me where the threshold is. They say it's in the basement." Riverside had a basement level that was mostly used for storage and mechanical systems. It also had a section that used to be the hydrotherapy area back when the hospital did those kinds of treatments. It had been closed off for years. Patients weren't allowed down there, and staff only went down when necessary. I guided Christopher back into his room and locked the door. This time I stood in the hallway and watched through the observation window for 20 minutes. He didn't move. He just sat on his bed. The door stayed locked. I finally went back to the nurse's station and told Janet we needed to move Christopher to a different room. She agreed and said she'd request it in the morning. But we didn't get the chance to move him. That same night, around 3 a.m., there was a power fluctuation in the building. The lights dimmed for a few seconds, then came back on. When I did my next bed check, Christopher's room was empty. The door was still locked. The window in his room was the kind that only opened a few inches and had bars on it. There was no way he could have gotten out. I immediately called for Janet, and we searched the entire unit. We checked every room, every closet, every possible hiding place. Christopher was gone. I radioed security, and they started searching the rest of the hospital. Janet called Dr. Brennan at home and told him we had a missing patient. About 45 minutes later, one of the security guards radioed that they'd found Christopher. He was in the basement, in the old hydrotherapy area. I went down there with Janet and 2 security guards. The basement was cold and dark. The hydrotherapy section was behind a locked door that required a special key. The head of maintenance had the only copy. But when we got down there, the door was hanging open. We found Christopher sitting on the floor in what used to be one of the treatment rooms. There were old rusty pipes on the walls and a drain in the floor. He was in the corner, the same way he'd been standing in his room those nights. When we approached him, he didn't resist. He stood up and looked at me with these completely lucid eyes. He said, "I found it. The threshold. It's right here. They've been trapped here for so long." We brought him back up to the unit and put him in the quiet room, which was a special isolation room with padded walls and constant observation. Dr. Brennan came in early that morning and evaluated Christopher. He increased his medication dosage and ordered 1-to-1 supervision, which meant an orderly had to be with him at all times. For the next few days, Christopher seemed more sedated. He stopped talking about thresholds and angels. He'd sleep most of the day, and when he was awake, he was pretty out of it from the medications. I thought maybe that was the end of it. But then other things started happening on the unit. Small things at first. Lights would flicker in the east hallway around 2 a.m. We'd hear footsteps coming from empty rooms. Doors that we knew we'd locked would be found open in the morning. Other patients started complaining about nightmares. One patient, a woman named Sandra who'd been stable for months, suddenly started refusing to go into the common area. She said she could see someone standing in the corner. When we asked her to describe who she saw, she described a person who wasn't there. The orderlies started talking about it in hushed conversations during breaks. Nobody wanted to say the unit was haunted, but that's basically what we were all thinking. One of the night nurses, a guy named Mike who'd worked there for years, said he'd never experienced anything like this before. Christopher remained in the quiet room for about a week. Then one night, I was assigned to be his one-to-one supervision. I sat in a chair outside the room where I could see him through the observation window. He was awake, sitting on the floor with his back against the wall. Around 2 a.m., he suddenly stood up and walked over to the window. He pressed his face against the glass and looked directly at me. He said, "David, can you hear them?" I asked him what he was talking about. He said, "The ones who died here. The ones from before. They're screaming." I told him to sit back down and that he needed to rest. He didn't move. He kept staring at me through the glass and he said, "You should leave this place. They're not done. They want everyone to know what happened to them." I felt this cold chill run down my spine. I asked him what he meant by what happened to them. He said, "The treatments. The experiments. They drowned them. They burned them. They cut into their brains. All in the name of making them better. But they just killed them and buried them, and nobody knows." I'd heard stories about the old days of psychiatric hospitals, about lobotomies and electroshock therapy, and all the horrible things that were done to patients before modern medicine. But Riverside wasn't supposed to have that kind of history. It was newer, built in the 60s when they were supposedly more humane. I reported what Christopher said to Janet. She dismissed it as delusional talk, which made sense. But I couldn't shake the feeling that he'd been so specific. The way he said it, like he really knew something. The next day, I went to the hospital's administrative office and asked if there were any historical records about the facility. The secretary, an older woman who'd worked there since the 70s, told me that Riverside was built on the site of an older asylum that had burned down in 1962. The old building had been torn down, and the new hospital was built in its place. I asked if there were any records about the old asylum. She said most of the records had been destroyed in the fire. That night, I couldn't stop thinking about it. I did some research online when I got home. I found some old newspaper articles about the fire. It had happened in July of 1962. 14 patients had died in the fire. The cause was ruled accidental, something about faulty electrical wiring. But there was one article from a smaller local paper that mentioned allegations from former staff members that the asylum had been conducting experimental treatments without patient consent. The allegations were never investigated because the facility had been destroyed. When I came back to work that night, I felt sick. I didn't know what to believe. Part of me thought I was letting Christopher's delusions get into my head. But another part of me couldn't ignore the coincidences. Around 1 a.m., there was an incident. One of the patients in Unit C, a man named Robert who is usually calm, suddenly became violent. He attacked another patient, and it took 3 of us to restrain him. During the struggle, he kept screaming, "Get them off me! Get them off me!" When we finally got him into the quiet room and sedated, I asked him what he'd been talking about. He said he'd seen hands coming out of the walls trying to grab him. 2 hours later, another patient had a similar episode. Then another. By 5 a.m., we'd had to restrain and sedate 4 different patients. All of them reported seeing things that weren't there. Hands, faces, people standing in corners. The entire unit was in chaos. Dr. Brennan came in and ordered all the patients to be given increased sedatives. He said it was some kind of mass hysteria, that one patient's delusions had influenced the others. But even he looked unsettled. Christopher, meanwhile, had been quiet in the isolation room. When I checked on him around 6 a.m., he was sitting peacefully. He looked at me and said, "They're angry now. You disturbed them when you came down to the basement. They don't want to be forgotten. I didn't respond. I just finished my shift and left. Over the next week, things got worse. More patients reported seeing things. The lights in the east hallway would turn off by themselves. We'd hear banging coming from the walls. One night, the entire unit lost power for about 5 minutes. When the backup generators kicked in, we found that every single door on the unit had unlocked. All 32 rooms. It took us hours to get all the patients secured again. The administration brought in electricians and maintenance crews to check everything. They couldn't find any problems with the wiring or the locks. Everything tested normal. I started having nightmares. I'd dream about the old asylum, about patients strapped to tables, about treatments that looked more like torture. I'd wake up in a cold sweat, unable to shake the images from my mind. One night, about 3 weeks after Christopher had been found in the basement, I was doing my rounds when I heard something coming from the east hallway. It sounded like water running. I walked down the hallway and realized the sound was coming from inside the walls. Like pipes were running, but louder and more violent. I stood there listening, and then I heard something else underneath the sound of water. Screaming. Muffled, distant, but unmistakable. Multiple voices screaming. I ran back to the nurse's station and told Janet. She came down with me to listen. When we got to the hallway, the sound had stopped. Everything was quiet. She gave me this look like she thought I was losing it. The next day, I requested a meeting with the unit supervisor, a woman named Margaret. I told her everything that had been happening. The doors unlocking, the patients seeing things, the sounds in the walls. I told her about what Christopher had said about the old asylum. I suggested that maybe we should move the patients off Unit C temporarily while they did a more thorough investigation of the building. Margaret listened patiently, and then she told me that I needed to take some time off. She said the job was clearly getting to me, that working in psychiatric care was stressful, and that I should use some of my vacation days. I tried to argue, but she was firm. She gave me 2 weeks mandatory leave. I left the hospital that day feeling defeated, but also relieved. I needed to get away from that place. During my 2 weeks off, I couldn't stop thinking about Riverside. I did more research into the old asylum. I found the names of the 14 patients who died in the fire. I found death certificates. I found one newspaper article that mentioned the hydrotherapy area had been where the most controversial treatments had taken place. I also found something else. A record of patients who'd been at the asylum in the months before the fire. There were 73 patients listed, but only 59 had been accounted for after the fire. 14 had died, but that left 14 unaccounted for. The records listed them as transferred to other facilities, but there was no documentation of where they'd been transferred to. I became obsessed with this. I spent days trying to track down what had happened to those 14 patients. I contacted other hospitals, looked through old records, called the State Department of Health. Nobody had any information. On my last day off before I was supposed to return to work, I got a call from Mike, the night nurse. He told me that Christopher Hale had died the night before. He'd been found unresponsive in his room around 3 a.m. They tried to resuscitate him, but couldn't. The preliminary cause of death was listed as cardiac arrest, but they were doing an autopsy to be sure. Mike also told me something else. When they found Christopher, his room door had been open, and there were wet footprints leading from his room down the hallway. Small footprints, like bare feet. They led all the way to the stairwell that went down to the basement. I asked Mike if they'd checked the basement. He said security had done a sweep but hadn't found anything unusual. I didn't go back to work. I called Margaret that evening and told her I was resigning effective immediately. She tried to talk me out of it, said I was throwing away a decent job, but I was firm. I couldn't go back to that building. About a month after I quit, I got a call from Janet. She told me that Unit C had been temporarily closed. Too many incidents, too many staff calling in sick, too many patients having adverse reactions. The administration was claiming it was due to an environmental issue, possibly mold or air quality problems. They were doing a full inspection before reopening the unit. Asked if they'd found anything. She said they'd found something in the basement, behind one of the walls in the old hydrotherapy area. They'd found remains. Human remains. At least a dozen bodies that had been sealed behind the wall, probably for decades. The hospital tried to keep it quiet, but word got out. There was an investigation. It turned out that the old asylum had been conducting experimental treatments on patients in the early 1960s. When patients died during these treatments, instead of reporting the deaths, the staff had hidden the bodies. When the fire happened in 1962, they'd used it as an opportunity to cover up what they'd done. They demolished what was left of the building and built the new hospital right on top of it. The remains were eventually identified. They matched the 14 unaccounted patients from the old asylum records. They'd all died in the hydrotherapy area. Most had drowned during forced water treatments. Some had died from experimental shock therapies. Riverside State Hospital closed completely about a year later. The bad publicity, combined with state budget cuts, made it impossible to continue operating. The building sat empty for a few years, and then it was demolished in 2007. I never worked in healthcare again. I couldn't. Every time I even drove past a hospital, I'd feel sick. The thing that haunts me most isn't the doors unlocking or the sounds in the walls, or even finding out about the bodies. It's Christopher. The way he said they'd been waiting. The way he said they wanted everyone to know what happened to them. I think about him sitting in that old hydrotherapy room in the basement. I think about what he said about the threshold between the living and the dead. And I wonder if he somehow knew. If he could sense what had happened there. If that's why he ended up at Riverside in the first place. I've tried to move on with my life. I work in IT now, about as far from healthcare as I could get. I got married. I have a normal life. But sometimes late at night, I still hear it. That sound of water running through pipes. And underneath it, very faint, the sound of screaming. And I know that what happened at Riverside isn't really over. Those patients who died, who were hidden and forgotten, they made sure their story was told. They used Christopher to do it. And maybe they used me too. I drive past the empty lot where Riverside used to stand sometimes. There's nothing there now. Just grass and weeds. The city plans to build condos there eventually. I wonder if the people who move into those condos will hear what I heard. I wonder if they'll see what those patients saw. I wonder if the threshold Christopher talked about is still there, waiting. I'll never know for sure. And honestly, I don't want to know. Some things are better left alone. But I do know this. What happened at that hospital was real. The bodies were real. The patients who tried to tell their story were real. And Christopher Hale, whoever he really was, he was the one who made sure we listened. I still think about him sometimes. About his last words to me. They want everyone to know what happened to them. And now, everyone does know. The investigation, the news coverage, the records that were finally made public. Those 14 patients who died in that basement aren't forgotten anymore. Maybe that's what Christopher meant by the threshold. Not a place between life and death, but a moment when the truth finally comes out. When the dead finally get to tell their story. And I just happened to be there when it happened.